as per plan, went for a camping trip near the border of Tennessee and North Carolina to spend the last days of our term holidays. Our first night went as smoothly as we'd hoped. The campfire crackled softly as we shared stories under the stars, the quiet of the forest wrapping around us like a warm blanket. We talked about everything: life, work, past trips, but mostly, we just enjoyed the silence, broken only by the occasional owl hooting or the wind rustling through the trees. The next morning, we packed our bags, ready for a hike we'd been dreaming about for weeks. The trail we chose was deep in the woods, winding through thick trees and over rocky terrain. The air smelled like fresh pine and damp earth, the kind of smell you could only find miles away from civilization. We spent hours walking, chatting, and laughing, both of us in the best of spirits. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere seemed to change. The trail got weirder as we moved further. The trees grew thicker, giving us a sense of fear, and the underbrush denser. We started noticing things that seemed strange. The ground felt firmer underfoot, almost unnaturally so, as though something heavy had settled there long ago. But we kept going, curiosity outweighing any hesitation. It wasn't until we stumbled upon a clearing that things really took a turn. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as we pushed through the last line of trees, we saw it, the wreckage of an old plane. It was partially hidden by overgrown bushes and vines, but there was no mistaking what it was. The fuselage was bent and twisted, its once shiny surface now faded and cracked from years of neglect. The tail was half buried in the dirt, and the wings had long since been torn off. What stood out most was the eerie quiet around it. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an uncomfortable stillness that made my skin crawl. I remember my heart racing as I stepped forward. This is a plane," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Liam was already moving around it, his curiosity taking over. "I think it's a wreck," he said, more to himself than to me. We both knew that much, but something about the scene felt off. It wasn't just the wreckage. It was the sense of abandonment, the isolation. It felt like we had stumbled upon something that wasn't meant to be found. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I walked around the wreck, careful not to step too close to the debris. The silence was unnerving, so much so that it was hard to ignore the knot that had formed in my stomach. There were still pieces of the plane scattered around buttons, shards of glass, torn fabric, and even some personal items. Some of it looked relatively new, but most of it had the weathered look of things that had been there for years. A faint smell of oil and rust hung in the air. Liam, who was always the adventurous one, wanted to get closer to the wreck, but I hesitated. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. "We should be careful," I said, my voice a little more firm than I intended. "This place, it feels wrong." He looked back at me, his face serious but intrigued. "It's just a plane crash, man. What's the harm in looking around?" I wanted to argue, to tell him that some things were best left alone, but the truth was, my curiosity was just as strong as his. We both stepped closer, though I could feel the weight of something unspoken in the air. The wreckage had a weird aura about it, like it was frozen in time, waiting for someone to come and uncover its story. Liam crouched down beside a pile of rusted metal, lifting a few scraps to see what lay beneath. He didn't say anything, but I saw his face twist in a mix of confusion and unease. "This doesn't look like it's been here as long as the rest of it," he said, pointing to a small bag of equipment near the wreck. The bag was torn open, and inside was some old camping tools, a flashlight, and a weathered map. I couldn't shake the thought that this place wasn't just abandoned. It had been untouched for a reason. The whole scene felt like a relic from the past, trapped in the woods, hidden from time. Liam stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "This is weird," he said, sounding almost reluctant. "We should go, man." I nodded, relieved that he was on the same page. We both took one last look at the wreckage before heading back down the trail, but the image of it stayed with me. As we walked away, I couldn't help but feel like we'd just witnessed something we weren't meant to see, something better left in the past. I wasn't sure why, but I had the distinct feeling that we weren't the first to find the wreck, nor would we be the last. We didn't talk much as we hiked back to camp. The strange quiet of the wreckage lingered in my thoughts, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves felt too loud, too sharp. When we finally made it back to the campsite, the fire we'd left behind had died down to nothing but a few glowing embers. That night, we did not say a word. We stayed outside our camp, waiting for the morning. Scrolling through our phones wasn't an option, as they were both dead. We were just processing what had happened. We didn't know when we fell asleep while sitting. The next thing we knew, the chirping of birds woke us up. Instead of doing anything, we just packed our things and drove home. It's been years. We both moved on with our lives, still best friends, but we could not forget it. Yet, we are still hikers now and work as counselors on weekends. Finally, the five of us, me, my cousin Matt, Sarah, Tom, and Lucy, got together near the lake area along the Appalachian Trail for camping. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the sun was about to set in 3 hours. The lake was beautiful, its surface glistening under the fading light, surrounded by towering trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. We set up our tents, built a campfire, and settled in for a night of talking and roasting marshmallows. As the night wore on, the air grew cooler, and a strange unease settled over us. It wasn't the normal feeling of being out in nature. It was something more unsettling, like we were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't say anything to the group. I thought maybe it was just my imagination, too many late nights reading scary stories on the internet. However, that uneasy feeling lingered through the night, and I caught myself glancing around every time the wind shifted or a twig snapped. The next morning, we decided to spend the day by the lake. Tom and Sarah went for a swim, while Matt and Lucy wandered off to explore the nearby woods. I stayed behind, sitting by the campfire, trying to distract myself by reading a book. That's when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. It was a small, battered bag near the edge of our campsite. It wasn't one of ours, and it hadn't been there the night before. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the best of me. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. Inside were a few metal objects, bent and twisted, almost like scrap metal small pieces that looked out of place in the peaceful surroundings. There was also a small stack of old photographs, their edges yellowed and curling. The photos didn't seem to belong to any of us, and I could tell they had been handled a lot, like someone had been obsessively looking at them. I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't like we were near any roads, so it didn't make sense for someone to just leave their things out here. I showed the items to the group when they came back, and everyone agreed that it was odd. We tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe it was just someone else who had camped there before us and left their things behind. But there was something about those photos, something that made my skin crawl. Later that afternoon, we decided to go for a hike along the lake's edge. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone hiding in the woods, but there was never anyone there. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, something even stranger happened. As we walked back toward our campsite, Matt noticed a man standing by the trees, not too far from our camp. He was standing still, just staring at us. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was another hiker, but then Matt spoke up, his voice low and tense. "That guy, he's been standing there for a while," Matt said, pointing subtly. We all turned to look, and sure enough, the man hadn't moved. He was holding a camera, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses, just observing us like he was taking mental snapshots of our every move. My stomach dropped. Something about him wasn't right. He didn't belong there. We didn't know who he was or why he was so interested in us. It was Sarah who finally spoke what we were all thinking. "He's watching us," she said, her voice trembling. Matt immediately turned to me. "We need to leave. Now." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The unease we'd all felt earlier had now escalated into full-blown fear. The man was still standing there, unmoving, his camera pointed directly at us. We quickly packed up our things, not bothering to look back. As we left the campsite, I couldn't help but feel the weight of those unsettling eyes on us, following us through the trees. All the way, we kept talking about what we had faced, expressing our overthinking thoughts and yapping away until we finally reached home. At home, we all slept as if we hadn't slept in ages. After 2 days, college classes made us busy, and we got back to our normal life. Yet, our minds kept drifting back to the lake when, a week later, the news broke. The local paper reported that a body had been found by the lake. A man had been discovered dead, his body partially submerged in the water. The police were calling it an accidental drowning, but something about the report sent chills down my spine. The article mentioned that the man had been seen around the lake in the days leading up to his death, taking pictures of hikers and campers. What made my blood run cold was what they found in his belongings, a collection of photographs. Dozens of them, all taken of people who had been camping or hiking near the lake, many of them us. There were also stacks of news, clippings, all centered around the deaths and disappearances that had occurred in the area over the years. The man had been obsessed with documenting everything: the photos, the clippings, the people who came to the lake. I couldn't help but think, what if we had become the next victims? I am grateful for following our instincts and leaving the place when we did. Since then, none of us have gone camping alone. We always go with a group of campers and counselors to combat the fear. Fortunately, we are all back to normal now and are planning to go hiking again, but this time at a spot where people are around. Friends were out to get beer, and I was in the camp, hiking at a nearby place, enjoying solitude on the Appalachian Trail. That day, the air was cold, but the breeze brought peace. At one point, I stood against the rock when I first saw him. Initially, he seemed like just another person, maybe another hiker. But something about the way he moved made me pause. He wasn't walking along the trail like a normal hiker. No, he was moving through the trees, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he was searching for something or someone. I froze, instinctively taking a few steps backward into the thick underbrush. My heart began to race as I realized he wasn't just wandering through the woods. He was looking for something. Or worse, someone. I crouched low, my breathing shallow, trying to stay hidden behind a thick tree trunk. My heart hammered in my chest, and my thoughts raced. What should I do? Should I just stay quiet and hope he leaves? Or should I try to get away, quietly, without making a sound? Then I saw a flash of metal in his hand. He was holding a gun. My blood ran cold. I had never been so scared in my life. Death, murder, and blood all were swirling in my mind. I didn't understand what a man with a gun was doing out here in the woods, alone, in the middle of nowhere. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I pressed myself further into the tree, hoping he couldn't see me. My hands trembled, and my stomach knotted in fear. The man moved closer, his eyes scanning the area as if he was looking for something specific. I didn't dare make a sound, not even to swallow. I could hear him muttering to himself, but his words were too soft for me to make out. His eyes kept moving, scanning the trees, the ground, the bushes around me. It felt like an eternity, and every second that passed seemed like a lifetime. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to make a sound. Every tiny rustle of leaves or snap of a twig seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The man took a few more steps, his boots crunching over the ground, and then, as if he hadn't seen anything unusual, he turned away. For a moment, I thought I might be safe. But my heart didn't stop racing. I stayed perfectly still, watching as he moved farther down the path. He kept the gun in his hand, his gaze never leaving the trees as he walked deeper into the woods. I couldn't tell if he was leaving or just checking more areas. My eyes stayed fixed on his movements, praying he would disappear. Minutes passed, and finally he turned a corner and vanished out of sight. I waited for what felt like forever, making sure he was really gone. My mind was in a whirl, trying to process what had just happened. A man with a gun, searching the woods. I couldn't make sense of it, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. When I was sure he was no longer in the area, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, my legs shaky as I stood up. I didn't even take the time to think. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring about my friends who were at the store, the branches scraping my arms, or the rocks I tripped over. I didn't look back. Every noise, every movement in the woods felt like it was him, following me, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself harder, faster, my breath coming in short gasps, until I reached the edge of the woods and saw the familiar outline of my house in the distance. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me. I collapsed against the wall, my heart still racing, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The fear didn't leave me, though. It clung to me, wrapping around my chest, making it hard to breathe. I immediately called the police, my voice shaky as I explained what had happened. They assured me they would look into it, but I could hear the skepticism in their voices. A man with a gun in the woods was something that didn't happen often around here, at least not in the way I had described it. Soon, my friends came back. They were shocked to see me in that state. I told them that I just didn't want to stay there. Mark, one of them, agreed with my words. He packed everything, and we left within the hour. We reached a nearby motel and stayed the night there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Everything was going through my mind. The next day, we reached home, and I decided one thing: say no to the forest. Tony and I had just reached the Colorado Rockies for camping. We set up camp near a beautiful, quiet stream surrounded by towering pines. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the mountain air had cooled, making it the perfect time for a campfire. We ate, laughed, and shared stories as the fire crackled, sending warm orange sparks into the sky. But as the night fell, a strange silence settled over the woods. The usual chirping of crickets had quieted, and the sound of the stream had dulled. Later, as we settled into our tents, ready for bed, the stillness in the air felt strange, almost oppressive. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to block out the sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just an instinctual feeling that something wasn't quite right. The night was too quiet. I must have dozed off for a few hours, but then I woke up with a sudden start. At first, I thought I had just imagined it, the sound of something scraping against the outside of my tent. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of animals in the underbrush. No, it was something else. Something moving. Something crawling. I peeked through the mesh of the tent, my eyes adjusting to the dark. That's when I saw them, dozens of them. Long, segmented bodies, wriggling and twisting in the dim light of the campfire. Centipedes. Big ones. They were crawling all over the ground, just inches from my tent. Some of them were so large, their bodies seemed to be glowing faintly under the light. My skin crawled as I watched them move, their many legs skittering across the dirt, so many that they seemed to blur together. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe I was just overreacting. After all, we were in the Rockies, surrounded by wildlife. But the sheer number of them was enough to make me uneasy. I could hear them now, skittering around outside, brushing against the tent fabric. Every so often, one would bump against it with a soft thud, and it was enough to send a chill through me. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, my hands trembling. But when I shone the beam of light toward the ground, I froze. The centipedes were everywhere. They were clustered by the base of my tent, some inching their way up the fabric, others wriggling through the dirt, looking for somewhere to hide. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with all those insects so close. I turned quickly and zipped my tent shut, heart pounding. I could feel Tony shifting in his tent, likely waking up to the same discomfort. I crawled over to his tent and whispered urgently, "Tony, get up! We need to move. There's something wrong with this place." He groggily unzipped his tent and sat up, blinking in the dark. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" "Centipedes. They're all over the ground outside my tent. I don't think we're safe here." He didn't argue. I could hear the panic creeping into his voice as he said, "You think we're dealing with something bigger than centipedes? Like snakes or scorpions?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to stick around to find out." Tony didn't need any more convincing. We packed up as quickly as we could, grabbing what we could carry, and moved to a new spot farther up the trail, hoping we'd be safer there. The woods around us were so still, and the air was thick with tension. We didn't speak much as we relocated, both of us on edge, constantly scanning the area for anything that might come at us from the darkness. We set up our tents again, farther away from the stream, but neither of us slept well that night. Every sound, every movement in the trees made us jump. We kept hearing things scurrying through the underbrush, but we couldn't see anything. I kept thinking of those centipedes, how they seemed to appear out of nowhere, and how close they had been to my tent. Something didn't feel right about that place. The next morning, we woke early, eager to leave the unsettling campsite behind. But as we began to pack up our gear, something made me pause. I looked down at the ground near our new campsite, and my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt, were the unmistakable signs of scorpions along with the centipedes. They were everywhere. Their tiny, spiny bodies were scattered across the ground, and some of them were even hidden underneath rocks and logs. It felt like we'd set up camp in a den of venomous creatures. The sight of them made my skin crawl over again. Tony and I exchanged a nervous glance. We hadn't even been there 12 hours, and already we had encountered more dangerous wildlife than I thought existed in these woods. "I don't know about you, but I'm not sticking around to find out what else is here," Tony said, his voice tight with fear. I agreed wholeheartedly. We packed up as fast as we could, too unnerved to even think about exploring the area any longer. Without further discussion, we hiked down, packed our things, and drove home. It was the first and last time I went camping without support. My parents, my little brother and sister, and I had just reached the Appalachian Trail for our dream camping trip. We found a quiet, peaceful spot by a creek. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the towering pines as we set up our tents and gathered around the campfire. The smell of pine and fresh air mixed with the sizzle of hot dogs roasting over the flames. We were a few miles into the woods, far enough from the main campgrounds that it felt like we had the place to ourselves. The serenity of the place was enough to make you forget the world. The crackling fire, the rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl, this was what I loved about camping, the peace and quiet. But it didn't stay that way for long. About an hour after dark, I first noticed the figure moving through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I saw the shape of a man, stumbling awkwardly between the trees. My father, always the cautious one, had his eyes on the figure right away, and I saw his expression shift from casual to concern. "Who's that?" I whispered to him, my voice barely above a hush. My dad squinted into the darkness, his brow furrowing. "I don't know," he said, "but stay close, just in case." The man approached our campsite, and I could smell alcohol in the air. He was swaying, unsteady on his feet, and carrying a rifle across his chest. My stomach knotted as he drew closer. "Hey, you're in my spot." The man's voice slurred as he stumbled into the light of our campfire. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was flushed red. This is my spot. I've been coming here for years, and you're stealing it from me." My father stood up immediately, his calm demeanor shifting to one of authority. "Sir, we're sorry if we're in your spot," he said in a calm but firm tone. "We just set up camp here a little while ago. We'll pack up and move if it's an issue." The man didn't seem to hear the sincerity in my dad's voice. He took a few unsteady steps toward us, waving the rifle in our direction. No, you don't get it. You've taken my spot. I've been coming here for years. You move." His voice rose, and I could see the wildness in his eyes. "We're packing up now," my dad said, his voice still calm but firm. "We'll move, no problem." But the man wasn't listening. He took another step forward, the rifle swinging dangerously with him. "No," I said. "Move," he yelled, his words slurring together. My mom, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, stood up slowly, her face pale. "Maybe we should just go," she said, her voice soft but nervous. "We can find another spot." "Not an option," the man sneered. "You've taken what's mine. You're not going anywhere until I say so." There was a tense silence, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My little brother was hiding behind my mother, his eyes wide with fear. My dad, still trying to keep his calm, turned to the rest of us. "Stay back, everyone," he said, his voice low. "We're getting out of here, right now." We quickly started packing up our things, but the man wasn't moving. His gaze never left us, and the rifle stayed pointed in our direction. He seemed to be getting more agitated, the alcohol and anger clouding his judgment. I could see the situation escalating, and I knew something had to be done. My dad glanced around, his eyes narrowing, and I could see him thinking quickly. Then, in one swift movement, he grabbed a long, fiery log from the campfire and swung it toward the man. The heat from the log illuminated the man's face, and for a moment there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. My dad stepped forward, swinging the log with surprising speed. The fiery end of it struck the man's rifle, knocking it out of his hands with a loud clatter. The man stumbled back, surprised, but my dad wasn't done. He shoved the man to the ground, keeping him pinned with the burning log still in his hand. The man struggled, but my dad held him down with all his strength. "Stay down," my dad shouted, his voice low and threatening. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The man continued to struggle for a moment, but then the sound of distant voices came from the trail. 2 park rangers appeared at the edge of the campsite, rushing toward us. The man's eyes went wide, and he stopped resisting, realizing that his chances of getting away were slipping. The rangers took over, handcuffing the man and reading him his rights. One of them turned to us, his face full of concern. "Are you all okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine worry. "We heard the commotion from the trail. We've had some reports of a drunk man with a rifle causing problems up here." "We're fine," my dad said, his voice steady but still tense. "Thank you for getting here when you did. Although everything was sorted, it affected us a great deal." The next day, we reached home, and after a few days, we were back to our normal lives, but we could not forget what we had experienced. After that, we stopped going to forests altogether.